This is the Comics Alternative Eurocomics, reviews of Equinoxes and Clear Blue Tomorrows. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward. And together we're one guy with a PhD and one guy who's definitely going to try and finish his dissertation this year.
Talking about European comics. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So Edward, is that a New Year's resolution now?
I guess you could call it that. Yeah. It hadn't actually numbered among them. Mine were a lot more modest, but it definitely should. I'll move it over to that column.
Okay, so you're locked in now because this episode is going out to all our listeners and they will hold you accountable.
Okay.
Yes. And on the January episode of the Eurocomics series, Edward and I are going to be discussing two recent releases. We're going to begin with Cyril Pedrosa's Equinoxes. After that, we're going to look at Clear Blue Tomorrows, written by Febian Velleman with art by Ralph Meyer and Bruno Gazzotti. But before we get into those discussions, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Eurocomics is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off the cover price. Sometimes it could be 50% off cover. But many times, you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I'm looking at Beautiful Darkness, written by Febian Velleman. It's a terrific book. We'll be touching on it today. It's in our discussion of his work. It's kind of like Suicide Girls meets Alice in Wonderland, and it's there for only $16, 30% off cover price. And also his All Ages series Alone, the first volume out from Cinebook, is available at less than $10. That's $9.77 at 30% off.
That's right. You can't beat the prices there at Discount Comic Book Service, whether it is European comics or any kind of comics. Western, manga, it doesn't matter. You're going to find great deals. So go to dcbservice.com. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Edward and Derek sent you. So, Edward, here we are in the very first Eurocomics episode of the new year. Happy 2017.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you and to all our listeners.
Yes, that's right. Has your year gotten off okay so far?
It has been. I think I was mentioning to you earlier before we started recording, work has been rolling in, so I think it's going to be another good year for Eurocomics. I have some new clients, U.S. publisher clients, and also some that I've just sort of awakened from several years of not doing comics. And, so I think we're going to be seeing some good titles from Boom, from Top Shelf, from IDW, and from Lerner Graphic Universe. I think it's shaping up to be a good year. And just as a note from, I hope you enjoyed last month's episode on Westerns. One of the Westerns that I'll be doing for Self-Made Hero is the next book from Frederick Peters, which is going to be a Western with fantastical and homosexual elements, written by a French comics writer of Vietnamese descent, a lady named Lu Hui Fang.
So you're doing that work currently?
Yeah.
And
I've done about 20 pages so far.
And when do you think when's the projected pub date?
That I don't know. I'm doing 3 books for Self-Made, and I'm not honestly, I'm not sure of their order. I think one is a nifty bio in their artist bio line of Magritte, and there's a lot of like nifty playing around with Magritte's imagery. And then I think that's going to be first out, and then the Peters book, and then the third and final volume of David B. David B's Best of Enemies: History of U.S. Middle Eastern Relations.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I like the first two books.
Yeah.
Yes. So you've got a lot of work on your plate, and in fact, speaking of your work, later in the show, we're going to talk about one of the books that you translated in the past.
Oh, I think I've translated both of these authors, one apiece. So it should, yeah. And I know them personally as well. I mean, not intensely, but they've done some. They're both at the forefront of the contemporary comics scene in France, and they've done some interesting work individually and also together. They've not directly collaborated, but they were both founding members, along with some other artists that we've discussed, like Bruno. Pedrosa and Velleman were both founding members of it. Alas, short-lived, but very, very enterprising and innovative digital comics magazine called Professor Cyclops. And a lot of it culled from a lot of the talent, the current generation of rising stars and young talent in France, and it was designed specifically to be digital only, and so it had things, it had minor animation in it. It had sound effects. It had short, like it had like that sort of comics animation, but also like short film animation. And it was they're really it was in partnership with Arte, the German-French television channel, and I think they had gotten a deal with Air France, where it was part of one of the magazines you could look at in flight, and they were trying to work on a deal with the Accor hotel chain, where you could actually read it on your TV in hotels as well. But I think it lasted about three years, and an issues came out every month like clockwork, but it just proved financially not viable. But I do think it's one of those things people will look back on as like one of the spearhead steps. When digital comics kind of come in, digital comics that are created specifically for the digital medium come into their own.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into a discussion of the specific titles that we're going to be looking at for this month. And we should mention that we're primarily focusing on two books, Equinoxes from Cyril Pedrosa, and then Clear Blue Tomorrows from Fabian Velleman with art by Meyer and Gazzotti. But we will also be discussing along the way other works from Pedrosa as well as Velleman, because that's something we wanted to bring into the mix. Now, the first work that we're going to be looking at is Pedrosa's Equinoxes. This is published by NBM, and it came out the 1st of September of last year. And you and I have had copies of this for a while, and it has been in our to discuss list for the Euro comic series. And so we're finally getting around to it, and I'm glad we are, because I absolutely love this book. I was familiar with Pedrosa before this. Now, I mentioned a while ago that at least one book that we're going to be discussing at some point is something that you translated. And my first introduction to Pedrosa was actually a book that you translated a number of years ago. And this is Three Shadows, that came out in the U.S. with your translation, in 2008. But other than that, the only other thing that I had read by Pedrosa until Equinoxes was actually nothing else. It was Equinoxes, and then when you and I were discussing the possibility of doing a show on Equinoxes, you introduced me to other translations of Pedrosa's work, such as Hearts at Sea and Portugal.
Yeah, Well, first off, I do want to say that like all the other books by these authors that we'll be discussing today are available in English, and that's why we're discussing them, partly to contextualize these latest works within their other available works in English, but also, just because these are people who have a foothold in English. These are not debut books. These are, if you love these books that we're talking about, there are other books out there for you to find. I mean, these are both authors who deserve, creators who deserve to be known, and they are making their way into English. So that's nice. And yeah, and Three Shadows was definitely Pedrosa's debut. I remember when Mark Siegel of First Second, he saw it and he just pounced on it. Like he would. I remember when he was talking to me about it, in emails offering me the job, he would gush over how like Pedrosa had come up with, he would see there were panels from angles that Siegel had never seen before in comics. Like he's just the way. And I think part of that, a widely known part of Pedrosa's bio is that he was a Disney animator,
right.
And even though Three Shadows is his English debut, however, Hearts at Sea actually predates it, and that's something that I hadn't known until I looked up Pedrosa. And it's funny because Hearts at Sea is something that I translated recently as well, and it's only available digitally. But I hadn't realized, because I sort of had, the U.S. debut of Pedrosa as Three Shadows had kind of like warped my sense of his development, or his journey, artistic journey, though. And I know Hearts at Sea is a personal favorite of Stuart Ing, the great comics bookseller and art bookseller located in Southern California, but always at all the best cons with his table of wonders. So I'm really glad that I was able to work on that. I'm sure he would prefer it to be a hardcover, but instead of digital only. But that's a book that he's always liked and had his eye on. Yeah.
There are other books that we've been talking about, and more actually than Equinoxes. I liked Hearts at Sea well enough. That to me struck me as a lighter book than some of the other things that we're going to be discussing by Pedrosa, especially the current one, Equinoxes. And something that you mentioned off mic before we started to record today, and this makes a lot of sense, is that one reason to talk about Pedrosa's earlier work is that you can see how the previous narratives kind of build up to and even contribute to what we get in this new book published last year from NBM, Equinoxes. I mean, I do think that of the Pedrosa books we're discussing today, that Equinoxes, the latest, is the most mature, that it is the most novelistic. And, you suggested to me that there are elements of, let's say, Three Shadows, Hearts at Sea, and Portugal in Equinoxes. And I think if you combine all of those elements, and not just the story or narrative elements, but even the art itself, it kind of builds up to Equinoxes. And I was bowled away by this book.
I think that's absolutely true. Equinoxes is a majestic piece of work, and both artistically, thematically, and narratively, it does seem like a culmination of a lot of his previous work. I think you mentioned liking Portugal a little more than I do. I think Portugal has a lot of great qualities, but ultimately it's a little too memoirish for me. And Equinoxes, as you said, it is more novelistic. It definitely has a lot more imposed structure, both with this structure of 4 seasons and also with a threading through of various narrative strands. But yeah, I definitely think, I think it's obvious for any reader. There's a black and white work that is definitely reminiscent of Three Shadows. There's color work that's reminiscent of Hearts at Sea and Portugal, and there, also there's a short strip that hasn't been translated that Pedrosa did there's a sort of all-star charity book that Delcourt did that has people like Alfred and Bruno and Pedrosa in it, and it was a charity book for undocumented immigrants and clandestine refugees, and his work in it actually is very, very reminiscent of the style used in the final section of Equinoxes, which is summer. But we should probably talk about Equinoxes and its structure, right?
Right. So, as the title suggested suggests, Equinoxes is a book divided into 4 segments that are linked to the seasons. It begins, I believe, with autumn and then moves from there. So you have a narrative in 4 sections, but it's also I don't know if you want to call it a fragmented or, let's say, banded. Polyphonic, yes, or even banded narrative, because there are different storylines that kind of weave back and forth, one kind of around the other, within each of these 4 sections. And I may be missing one, but right before we started to record, I started to map those out in terms of notes. So in terms of the multiple storylines, the first one we get, and we get these at the very beginning of each of the 4 sections, is what we can call, I guess, maybe not necessarily prehistoric, but an early human story, where you have a young boy who is just out in the natural world doing, well...
survival things.
Yes, survival things, what an individual would do.
In the first one, he's hiding from a tiger. In the second one, he's hunting a rabbit, like that kind of stuff.
Right. And the significance of these little bits of that storyline don't seem to make much sense until you get toward the end of the book, and then things start to come together. Another storyline, and this is a major one, in fact, I would suggest that this is the binding element among many of these stories, is the woman with a camera. And I think at one point we do get her name, don't we?
Yeah, it's Camille, isn't it?
Is it Camille?
Yeah, it's Camille or Camille. Yeah, I think.
But she is largely without much of an identity, and in fact, up until the final pages, you don't get to see her face at all. But what's significant about her is that through her camera, you get to see the faces of a variety of other people, all of which are not really characters in the book, but people that she encounters just out in life.
People she steals snapshots of. But
Exactly.
I would argue that it's not that she doesn't have an identity. I mean, it's true that Pedrosa very carefully hides her face from us, buries her in crowds, shoots her from the back, cuts off her head in framings. But we get a lot of interior monologue from her in prose that is just chunked on the page. It's like kind of like and I don't know. I shouldn't speak wrongly about fonts, but let's just say it's a sans serif font in the Arial in the Arial mode, let's say, and it's like whole pages of interior text for her, and also backstories that she attributes to these people whose snapshots she steals.
Right. Yeah. Now, the backstories are the stories and identities of the other people, and we don't even know if these are actually correct or not. For all we know, she's just making up the lives of the people whose photographs she's snapping.
Yeah, projecting.
Yeah, right. But you're right. There are other large prose sections, and these are at the end of each of the 4 sections where it's like interior dialogue where or monologue where she's talking about herself or things that she's experienced. So when I said she's not given much of an identity, what I should have said is she's not given much of a visual identity, because whenever we see her, it's primarily her body from the back or to the side. You almost always see her with the camera, but Pedrosa intentionally withholds her face from our vision until the very end of the book. And I think that there's a reason for that, because visually speaking, she's someone who's much more into capturing other identities, visual identities, than displaying her own.
Yeah, absolutely. But she does, since she's in the present day, at least she does inhabit.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. Inhabit the sort of the same visual style as the other characters are about to discuss. Whereas the little boy, in these sort of offset section headers, there's a distinct art style and also panel design. I mean, they're either 1 or 2 panels a page centered, lots of white space, and then we sort of hit the mainstream. Not the mainstream, but the
more contemporary storylines.
Yeah, the contemporary storylines with the more traditional panel layouts and scenery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Now, there are two other ongoing braided storylines that run throughout the book as well. And one of those other storylines includes an older gentleman, Lewis, and he is not doing very well health-wise, and his relationship with I guess she's an administrator, a city administrator named Catherine, and we rarely see her, but she's always a part, or seems to always be a part, of conversations with Lewis and people around him. Now, there's another individual, a young man who is with Lewis. I can't remember his name. I don't know if it's a family member or a friend who comes by to help him with things every now and again. And much of what's going on around Lewis's life and the people who are associated with him is that in their town, they're in the early days of constructing a new airport, and the villagers aren't enamored of that idea. And so they're protesting this, and they're also trying to get Lewis to lobby his friend, who is an administrator in the government, to work to use her pull to work against the building of this new airport.
Yeah, she's a minister of sustainable development and the environment, I believe is the title they give her.
It's her official title, yeah. And then yet another storyline that we get is from a middle-aged man by the name of Vincent, and he's an orthodontist. We learn fairly early on that his family life is not what it used to be. He's separated from his wife. They both share custody of their teenage daughter, Pauline. And so he has kind of a mixed relationship with Pauline. It's not a very positive relationship with his ex-wife. But at least in the last half of the book, one of the things that distinguishes Vincent's storyline is the arrival of his younger brother, Damien, who is a priest.
Yep.
And what we see between Vincent and Damien, the things that they're talking about, the things that they go through together, they take one or two trips, talking about their lives, talking about their place in the world, and when it comes right down to it, they discuss the kind of things that I think Equinoxes is all about, and these are these heavy existential issues, right? I mean, why are we here? What sense do we make of our lives? What kind of meaning can we generate from our existence? And so, I mean, Equinoxes, when we were talking about this as being a grand narrative, this is definitely novelistic. It deals with these large life issues.
Yeah, and Pedrosa has always been he's been someone he's very sensitive in his portrayals of characters, attentive to details, attentive to posture, expression, lighting, color, setting. The setting gets a lot of mileage in this book, especially for characterizing Louis the old man and is it Vincent the orthodontist?
Right.
Because he lives in this sort of seaside promontory modernist house that's all glass walls and very sterile, and there's a lot of indirect commentary on the loneliness of his life in this sterile environment, et cetera. Whereas Louis lives in a very traditional Breton countryside house with a lot of history that there's mention of past tenants and other people that he sheltered, and I think one of the very French conflicts in this book is I think it's something that pops up a lot in French lit, but and sometimes I think something that Americans have a harder time accessing is Louis was a very active former member of the Communist Party.
Right.
And the communist dream was alive and well in France long after, or at least as a political force trying to shape change, not trying for the revolution, even just trying to affect what they saw as human oriented change. Alive and well in France for much longer than, whereas America has always had this pitted relationship against it. So like it kind of erases it and its influence from history. But so like a lot of Louis' disappointment at his late age in life and regret comes from this lifetime of fighting what seems to him now an ultimately futile battle, and the threat of this new airport going up is one of the things that very subtly I think gives the book it's in this book it's the equivalent of a ticking bomb, right? It'll go off at the end. Things we'll finally get to see the protests that everyone's talking about, because everything in this book, I think there's such natural, convincing and absorbing naturalism in how things are presented that the time kind of meanders in this slice of life way, and then you don't realize that there actually are narrative structures ordering things underneath an extremely fluid presentation.
Right. Now, you mentioned the construction of the airport, and we don't want to give anything away in this book, but one thing that is connected to the construction of the airport that actually puts it into question at some point links back to one of those earlier storylines we discussed with the young boy. In the early human, this young kid surviving, do what he can to survive, getting away from wild animals and whatnot, and that eventually links up to what's going on with the airport later in the book.
Yeah, no, I mean that's one of the things that struck me at this book about is that I feel like more than any other Pedrosa narrative I've read, it comes together. Mm-hmm. And that's very narratively satisfying because there's already so many other things he's good at. But yeah, I was very pleased with that. I mean, one of the things that personally interests me the most about Pedrosa, and I know I have a little bit of a hobby horse when it comes to sound effects, but I guess I think of him as an almost Altman-esque, Robert Altman-esque, in that he's always been one for using ambient sound to build atmosphere. And a lot of his crowd scenes at open air flea markets or bus stations or things are filled with snippets of overheard conversation, and just little things that are not even going to make sense. And so it's almost like he's one of the cartoonists I see that is really, really making use of soundtrack. And so it's the same in more intimate, quieter scenes. He assigns onomatopoeia written sound effects to a lot of things that I think people just skip over, like lighting a lighter or the wind blowing through the trees or little noises of
crinkling
droplets.
Paper.
Yeah, crinkling paper, droplets falling, and he does a lot of that, and it's all for atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And he's one of the few I feel like I feel like a lot of serious cartoonists these days have decided to drop sound effects except when they absolutely need them. Like in Fun Home, I think you can only find the ringing, a phone ringing or a door knock as the only sound effects. Same for Persepolis, but because I think I think sound effects are to some extent tinged with the adolescence of comics that people want to leave, the juvenilia of comics that people want to leave behind. But it's interesting to see someone who's clearly got serious literary ambitions, but also clearly likes them and puts them to good effect.
Right. Another thing, you were mentioning the uses of sound in Equinoxes that is, I think, quite effective, and I agree with you. I wasn't going to go with the sound element. I was going to come back to the visual elements of Equinoxes, especially thematically. Now, we mentioned earlier that one of the major storylines is the young woman with a camera. And what is her name again? Camille?
Yeah.
Camellia?
Camille, I think. Yeah.
Camille. So, I mean, with her camera, she captures images of people out in life doing mundane things, waiting on a bus or at a market, again, doing everyday things. But in the other storylines, we have similar means of, visual capture. In other words, the framing or the capturing of visuals in some form or another means everything to, or means a lot to all the characters in the stories here. So, for instance, with Louis and especially the older man, one of the things we see early on that interests him, you mentioned him kind of giving up on leftist idealism, but one of the things that does draw his energies and attention is a particular painting that he discovers at one point and then makes the effort to find the original and then to place it at his home. So that's something that is very similar to what Camille does in terms of taking pictures. With Vincent, the orthodontist, he gets this, what do you call it, a 3D photograph box? What is the official name?
Stereoscope.
A stereoscope, right, where he can look at photographs in 3D for that effect. So again, it's very similar to Camille with her camera and Louis with his painting. Even in the early human story with the young boy in the wild, what we see him do in terms of a cave painting is, I would argue, the same thing as what we have with the more modern or contemporary people with their cameras and their stereoscopes and their paintings.
Yes, there's a lot. There's definitely one of the major, I think, redemptive elements in the book is definitely art. I mean, I don't mean the art of the book. I mean art as being able to, well, like
as a way to generate meaning. Is the way to make sense of life. The
famous Kafka line for a book should be an axe for the frozen sea within. But these are these moments of these encounters with art in this book break the frozen seas within these characters in different ways.
Right. Exactly. So it may seem on first reading or maybe on quick reading that you have multiple storylines going on in 4 different sections of a book. But when you look at what Pedrosa's doing, and I think this is what makes it so damn novelistic, is he's weaving these stories together in a way that they link iconically, thematically, visually, in terms of character development, the dilemma that every one of the main figures seems to be in. I mean, it's all there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's really, I would say also visually, he's very spare. A crowd scenes apart, he's pretty sparing with his speech balloons and dialogue. Which makes for even more of a contrast with the prose block sections. Sometimes I think the longest they go on for 3 or 4 pages, I think, is one of the longest ones, but usually just 1 page or 2.
The prose, yeah.
Yeah. So, that was, that's quite a contrast in terms of narrative feel, I think.
Okay, so let me ask you on this topic, did your personal taste, do you feel that those prose blocks, whether they were 2 or 3 pages or those that went a little longer into 4 or so, do you think that they worked well or that they provided something like reading speed bumps? That you had to get, I mean, they were okay, but you just had to get over in order to get back to the next bit of comic. In other words, were you okay with those prose blocks?
Yeah, I'm not. I would say that on a purely personal level, I see how they fit into the narrative, but on a purely personal level, I do think they don't show off. To be perfectly honest, I feel like they don't show off Pedrosa's talents as well as the rest of the book. And I did find them, I see all the ways in which they're supposed to work, but they're not my favorite thing. No.
Yeah, I think they were interesting attempts, and I think that in some cases they were quite successful. I do feel that those prose blocks at the end of each section, where we get the interior monologue of Camille in essence, the photographer. Those, which is just straight text with no illustration whatsoever, tend to get a little heavy at times. The other blocks of prose where we get Camille taking pictures of other people and then speculating perhaps on what their lives are like, those are interspersed with a few illustrations here or there. It's almost as if the photograph that she takes then kind of spins off and transforms along with this speculation of that individual's life. And so I think that there is a little more of a balance between text and image, but those prose blocks at the end of each section where we get segments of Camille's herself, her life, those tend to feel a little heavier and weightier.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I'm not even such a huge fan of the font that was chosen, though I know it's the exact same font as in the original. But for some reason, a lot of I do agree. Also, I do think the her speculations on other people are generally more compact and trenchantly written than her investigations of her own. Really, just like kind of what happened to her in the last year or so, right? She kind of drifted apart from some friends, and then they lent her a house, and then she didn't know what to do with herself for a while, but she bought an old a single lens reflex camera, which is the one we see her using. Mm-hmm. But when she spins off into the speculations of other people, there's usually a black and white snapshot, presumably the one she takes, that's at the bottom corner of the page, and it has a caption that's in this sans serif font, right? And I think the sans serif font somehow looks fine there. It looks even right. And then you get the next page, which is usually more black and whites, more captions, and then you followed by a third page of nothing but text.
Right.
And somehow by the time I get to nothing but text, I start to like that font less and less. I don't know what it is. Because it seems to be fine as a caption, and maybe it's just that it's, I don't know, maybe I feel like the images balance it off or something. I feel like it's but that's that's actually, I don't actually need to dwell on this because I can't say how much else there is going for the book. This is this book is really, really amazing.
Right, it is.
So yeah, it's yeah.
Now, of the other books that we were reading and are bringing into our discussion of Pedrosa this month, the one I like the most is Portugal. And with Portugal, the main difference between, which is also very novelistic, but the main difference between Portugal and Equinoxes is that with Portugal, you have, for all practical purposes, a single figure, a young man, or I guess he's middle-aged at this point, by the name of Simon, trying to make sense of who he is within the context, especially of his family and his family's past. And I think we have, in terms of this search of self and in search for meaning, the same thing in Equinoxes, except with Equinoxes, you don't have a single individual, you have an ensemble cast. And
right.
So it's multiple stories. So I think that what Pedrosa's doing in Equinoxes is in some way, in terms of story, what he does earlier with Portugal. He just ramps it up and applies this to multiple individuals and their relationships.
Yeah, I think something, even though Three Shadows takes place in a sort of fantasy world, one thing that feels true to about Hearts at Sea, Three Shadows, and Portugal is this sort of freeform sense of narrative. I'm just going to keep pushing. I got a character or two, and usually just really one, and I'm just going to keep pushing them as far as I feel like taking them. Set them on an adventure or a journey or something, and maybe they learn something, maybe they don't, maybe they meet someone, I'll just keep seeing how far I can go with it. And so, yeah, whereas this one, again, there's in Equinoxes, there's more of an overarching structure that contains these seekers, these individual seekers. But there are a lot of repeated themes, like the difficulty of family relationships, wanting to escape them and at the same time return to them. I think that's very present in Portugal.
Right.
And also alienation and disaffection from your contemporary life, whatever it is, often in a vaguely artistic track. Because I believe he's a disaffected cartoonist in Portugal, right?
Right.
And so and then in Portugal, at least, he and also the search for love, but usually not very fulfilled, like in Hearts at Sea. Like if it's fulfilled, it's in some sort of tangential way, but it's not like a happy end, rom-com happy ending. But I think in Portugal also he drifts into dream sequences, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think there's not as. Are there any in Equinoxes? I don't think so.
Any fantasy sequences?
Yeah, and any dream sequences.
There are sequences where I think is the equivalent of, I guess, interior consciousness in some way or another. Maybe I'm thinking primarily of those scenes where Camille takes the photographs, and then the photographs or those images seem to kind of transform in an almost dreamlike way.
Or there's the scene where like when the orthodontist is looking into
Vincent.
the stereoscope.
Oh, that's right.
Vincent, and it gets very the art gets very, very expressionistic and much more hazier, much hazier. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's the scene toward the last part of the book where Vincent is with his brother Damien, and they're out, and the art does get much vaguer and less precise. And in fact, this is the section where we get an image that appears on the cover of Equinoxes.
Yeah.
Where it's just stripped down visuals, really, without much context, without much setting or surrounding.
Yeah, and the formal control on display in Equinoxes is also really staggering. I actually have to say I'm not a huge fan of the NBM cover choice. It is different from the French cover. But I do think it makes the book look weirdly forbidding and perhaps even more experimental than it actually is. But then I do find like the sort of the color schemes that he devises for each of the seasons they're really so well handled. I mean, right from page one, this is a book of just breathtaking visual beauty, but also like, I mean, when I got to summer, and summer has this kind of tourist poster / children's book kind of vibrancy to the colors, and things kind of escape their outlines. There's and come alive, and it really was like walking into summer. There's this huge breath of relief of like this is a triumphant season.
It's interesting to hear you, a non-Texas resident, talking about welcoming summer. For us in the Lone Star State, or at least for me, it's a little more oppressive than that.
Yeah.
But you're right. Now, we've been talking about some of these other books by Pedrosa. We should mention a little bit about where our listeners can find those. Now, Three Shadows, as we mentioned, was originally published by First Second in 2008. Now, that book is no longer in print, and I guess if you wanted to find it, you could get used copies of it fairly easily enough. But that's been out of print, I guess, for a little while. And both Portugal and Hearts at Sea, you can find, the digital versions in English are available through Europe Comics. I think, weren't they both originally published in France by Dupuis, and now are available in translation digitally through Europe Comics?
Yeah, and so Europe Comics stuff is always available on iTunes, Kobo, sometimes on Comixology, but not always. Mm-hmm. And also on through Amazon. Right. So, those. Yeah.
Now, I think that Hearts at Sea, if I was looking at the correct place, that this was translated into English and made available through Europe Comics last year, 2016. And
I did it in.
So you did it.
I did it in the fall, early fall, I think.
Okay, I was curious because I was wanting to know about any lag time between when you finished the translation and then when it became available. So you finished it in the fall of last year?
Yeah, I would say I don't. I can actually tell you exactly when I finished it, but the thing is, the lag times for the digital comics I find are really, really unpredictable because digital comics are a fairly experimental venture for both Delcourt and Dargaud Dupuis, or Mediatune. Delcourt releasing through Comixology and Mediatune or Dargaud Dupuis releasing through Europe Comics. And by experimental, I mean that they're constantly, as you and I both know, sadly, they don't have much media presence in the U.S. Like not many readers know about the wealth of material that's already available digitally here, and that's partly due to just not really being sure how to market it. But also another aspect is that they're constantly rejiggering which titles they want to put out because they're learning from their sales figures, they're learning from reader interest, and so they're always changed. So like you might be signed on to do one title and then they'll be like, no, we're going to swap it out for this one. So so the trouble is that so when I say that the lead times can be very different is sometimes I'll get a message being like, no, we want this one and we want it right away. And you're like, oh, okay. So that'll be so then you'll finish it. You'll go through a round or two of proofing with them, and next thing you know, it'll be out. Whereas other things, I've translated for them over a year ago, still aren't out. Mm. Yeah, because they're always changing their minds about what they want to put out.
Right, and we've discussed
August. I finished it in mid-August.
Okay, and we've discussed Europe comic digital releases before. Back in October, we reviewed Tyler Cross BlackRock.
Right.
Yeah, and that was released
Bruno
through.
book.
Right, and that was released through Europe Comics. So, our listeners can still get those, and you can probably get a used copy of Three Shadows. And I think it is an interesting exercise to read this new book, Equinoxes, again, which came out in September of last year, within the context of some of these other Pedrosa works that are available in English now, because you do get to see the development of a creator in how, both visually and also in terms of storytelling, he does, I don't want to necessarily say improve with each new work, but how the work of a previous effort kind of informs what he does next.
I wanted to ask you, as the English prof, because I can be really hit or miss with my reading, and I'm definitely a miss in the case of Equinoxes. Like, did you feel that there are explicit references to Thomas Pynchon's Vineland and
right.
also Virginia Woolf's The Waves? Did you feel that those – I haven't read either of those, sad to say. So did you feel that that was reflected as more than just a level of mention in the narrative? Did you see like correspondences or? I
didn't, but then again, I know that Vineland is one I haven't read. But from what I know of Vineland, I didn't sense any kind of literary significance to those. In other words, I'm wondering if in this book, instead of, for example, mentioning Pynchon's Vineland, if another book and another writer could have been mentioned there, like the 2 or 3 times that it does come up, and no meaning would be lost whatsoever. Now, maybe those of our listeners who are familiar with Pynchon's Vineland will disagree with me and say, oh, no, it is significant and for these reasons. And if so, yeah, definitely get in touch with us and let us know. I didn't see any links there between those texts, the Virginia Woolf or the Pynchon, that are mentioned, and what's going on in Equinoxes.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of for the Pynchon really is just in a very, very generalized way. Pynchon also chronicles the fallout of failed 60s radicalism, but like that's such a minuscule element of that's such a vague thing to it just, if anything, that just seems to be like, oh well, no wonder the character Louis, the former Communist Party member, is the one reading him. But that's right. Like that. It's a character note more than anything else.
Right, and if they were going to link his past with his leftist past with reading material, then I think there would be other books that would be much more appropriate than that. That both highlight the more leftist or communist side of the American historical experience, or the critique of it. I didn't see anything in there, and at the same time, I didn't see anything really heavy-handed when it came to the literary references. Now, there's sometimes that I'm reading certain comics where literary works, literary figures, literary histories or tendencies are referenced in at times seem to be kind of a heavy-handed way. I wouldn't necessarily call it heavy-handed, but I do think from the number of times I've read Funholm that at times Bechdel kind of teeters on almost hitting us over the head in a heavy-handed way. The literariness of that book, right? Just the mentioning, the references of literature with a capital L. I don't think she crosses that line, but I think she approaches it. But there are other works at times that I wonder, do you need to mention this? Do you need to let us know so strongly that there are these literary references here? But I think that what Pedrosa does in Equinoxes is nicely inserted. It seems appropriate. It doesn't strike me as too much, and I think it works.
Yeah, speaking of Funholm, I'd love to see a musical adaptation, a stage musical adaptation of Equinoxes. I think that would be pretty awesome. I think it's a very musical book in its way. You'd have to find some other way of handling those text blocks that we were niggling about, but
Yeah. Yeah, how would you do something like that? Would those be, let's say, vocal presences with a completely blackened stage?
Yeah, maybe like monologues. Yeah. That might even set him off more from I don't know. It could be something through song. I could imagine something through song with motifs that change from season to season to reflect the way the the art changes. But because a lot of the great French musicals are through song too, like Umbrellas of Cherbourg.
Oh, that's a great film. I haven't seen that in a long time.
Or Les Mis, even that's through song, and that's by French people. Yeah.
Well, Edward, you want to move on to the next book that we're going to be looking at this month, and that is Clear Blue Tomorrows, written by Febian Velleman, with art by Ralph Meyer and Bruno Gazzotti.
Yep.
Now, this came out the 1st of December of last year from Cinebook.
Yeah, is this the first Cinebook that we've... No. That we did a bunch of Westerns.
Yeah, we did. We did a couple last month.
Okay, good. And like the others, this is translated by it's translated by Jérôme Saint-Quentin, and just as most NBM books, Equinoxes was translated by Joe Johnson. So
how do we introduce the story of Clear Blue Tomorrows?
Well, it's a overtly science fictional story, but and there's a time travel frame, but time travel really isn't an important element. I guess there's a future in which there's a corporation that's pretty much taken over the world, and Technolab, and it's implanted everyone with these chips that keep them fulfilled, but they also keep people from harming the sort of tycoon, the
CEO of the company.
Yeah, I was going to say Jobs, but he's really more of a Microsoft kind of looking.
He looks more like Bill Gates than he does Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
But this guy's name is F.G. Wilson, so he is the CEO of Technolab, and it's a future that, at least at first glance, seems to have a lot of things figured out, a lot of wants that are taken care of, but it's nonetheless an oppressive future because of what F.G. Wilson has done. And as you mentioned, everyone has an implant to where if they think about or about to harm Wilson, then they will get, a shock to their system, I guess, that will keep them from doing this. Right, exactly.
They're incapacitated. And so this engineer named Nolan Scott resents this state of affairs so much that he invents a time machine to go back and kind of kill Hitler, right? To prevent Wilson from ever getting a job at Technolab and working his way up from the mailroom to de facto leader of the world.
Right.
But everything we've just told you happens in the first 2 pages or 1.5,
right.
Really. That's just the setup for.
basically the frame of what this book is all about, which is a collection of stories. Now, you mentioned that the chip inside of the head will not allow people to kill Wilson, and so time does not change that. So when Nolan Ska goes back in time, I think there's one moment that he gets really pissed off at Wilson and he's going to hit him, but then the chip stuns him, and of course it leaves him unconscious momentarily. So Nolan cannot kill Hitler in this case, but what he plans to do is to change Wilson's life in such a way that he will not become the CEO and the figure that he does in the future with Technolab. And he remembers hearing about Wilson's past that Wilson liked to write. And at one point he had considered himself to be a pretty good writer, and that he may even want to grow up to be a writer. So when Nolan Ska goes back in time, he meets up with F.G. Wilson, and he thinks that he's going to help nurture his interest in writing science fiction.
Well, yeah, because what happens is there's a tragic event where Wilson's first novel manuscript gets stolen while he's at a cafe, and that's part of the real timeline, such that when Scott goes back and tries to prevent that, because he had heard from history that that lost novel was a manuscript, and that Wilson never recovered from its loss.
Right. It's like Hemingway's famous stolen or lost
suitcase.
Yeah.
So then he finds out that this novel is a piece of shit.
Yeah.
And so he undertakes to try to help make him make him more successful as a writer, to prevent him ever joining Technolab. And he does so by giving him essentially or writing for him short stories from the future. So they're SF stories. They're little SF stories they're witty little things that allow Velleman to work out some kind of tiny, occasionally Twilight Zone-esque premise. Things like steroidal athletes or haunted space stations or
futuristic prisons.
Prisons.
Where everyone is required to watch and enjoy a soap opera. Yeah, and they're fascinating stories. So in essence, Nolan becomes the ghostwriter to Wilson, and he hates doing it, but he must continue to do it because he feels that if he doesn't continue to ghostwrite for Wilson, then Wilson will become what he eventually becomes. In other words, the historical line will pick up where it left off, right? And that the result would be a history that is oppressed by Technolab, with Wilson at the helm. Now, in this way, Clear Blue Tomorrows reminds me a lot of 1001 Nights.
That's a good...
Because you have to have, just as with 1001 Nights, someone must tell the story in order to live another day. An interesting twist on this is in Clear Blue Tomorrows, in that Nolan must tell another story, or write for Wilson another story, in order to, he hopes, live the kind of life in the future, or to provide the kind of future that he would like to have, that he definitely doesn't have when this book opens. So in this way, I kind of wondered if we could read Clear Blue Tomorrows as some kind of maybe short story cycle, or what I would call visual or narrative graphic cycle. It's a little different from, let's say, Adam Serlich, that we read on our very first episode back in July of last year. I think that was a clear case of a graphic cycle, something, the comics equivalent of a short story cycle, where you have a variety of different stories that are all interlinked by a variety of different ways. For instance, setting, character, and what have you, and of course, theme. Here, we have a variety of different stories that by themselves aren't linked in any way one with the other, except for the fact that they are the creation of Nolan in his ghostwriting for Wilson. So it's a collection of stories, maybe serialized stories, or if you want to call them serialized novellas, that are linked by a broader kind of loose frame.
Yeah, and I mean, these are all kind of humorous or vaguely one idea stories that are humorous or vaguely or ironic or throughout the frame story, Wilson's character remains pretty flat as opposed to round. Like he's a jerk.
He's an asshole at the beginning, and he is at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, and pretty much in the same way, is just bigger. There is some other narrative resolution for Ska, but it's I wouldn't say it's a massive emotional journey either. It's just I guess I mean, like, in its way, but like I guess for me yeah, I do think this can credibly be read as a story cycle. And the other interesting thing is, well, I translated another one book of Velleman's only that he did with Gwen de Bonneval, and it's also a far future science fiction book, and it's one of the it's called Last Days of an Immortal. I did it, I think, about 5 years ago now, for Archaea when they still existed, before now they're part of Boom. And so I'm not sure if it's in print anymore, but it was one of the few comics that I ever successfully pitched to a publisher to take on, and I did it because I believed in it. I really loved it. I thought it was one of the best science fiction comics I'd ever read. A couple things strike me between that and this is, is that in both cases, if you read the bios for Meyer, Gazzotti, and Velleman at the end of Clear Blue Tomorrows, they kind of play this shell game about like who did what, who did how much art where, who wrote, who came up with which idea. And that's another thing that Fabian Velleman and Gwen de Bonneval in Last Days of an Immortal, they were like, it was a completely symbiotic relationship. They would talk about, it wasn't one person doing the art, one person doing the writing, or, and so it was after that book that I kind of started reading a lot more Velleman and Bonneval, just exploring their other work. But one of the even though Last Days of an Immortal is a much more cohesive narrative, it's definitely not a short story cycle. To me, it has a similar narrative gambit, which is like Velleman just clearly is someone who's overflowing with ideas as a writer, and he just studs his it's like studying a muffin with raisins or something. He just studs his science fiction stories with them. So there's a through line to Last Days of an Immortal, but there's a lot of tiny episodes throughout that are kind of like, they're maybe not standalone stories anymore, but definitely their own episodes with their own little mini conflicts and their own separate ideas from the main idea of the book. And another thing that Velleman did was it's interesting because Pedrosa had its background in animation, but Velleman did as well. He was a writer and voice talent on a bunch of this sort of cult. I don't know if you could call it a series, but it was definitely televised. They're these sort of 45-second televised mini narratives, and it was basically, they were called "Have You Ever Seen?" And it would always be like, have you ever seen, and it would be something outlandish, like, have you ever seen a duck in an elevator, or, something like that. So then, so I do think he likes these sort of like nifty little pieces, and that's how it's not always, I find him a pretty protean writer, but it can be how he builds larger narratives with these tiny narratives. But as we're gonna we see, we read some other Velleman for this week as well, and there's very different narrative gambits on display throughout. But
right.
Yeah.
Now, Clear Blue Tomorrows is definitely a different kind of book from Equinoxes. We were calling Equinoxes novelistic. I definitely wouldn't call Clear Blue Tomorrows that. And not just because it's primarily a collection of stories or a story cycle in some way. It's a lighter work. I think it's fun. I don't think it takes itself too seriously, whereas Equinoxes is definitely a serious, heavy work, both in its intent and also in terms of its themes. Now, the way that you described the individual stories that Nolan is ghostwriting for Wilson, you used a reference to the Twilight Zone. I think that perfectly encapsulates the kind of stories that these are. Some are serious, some are a little more on the humorous side, but they all have that kind of weird, quirky, at times almost O. Henry-esque ending twist. And these could each have been episodes of The Twilight Zone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's an explicit reference to that, in like I think at one point, Wilson is for Wilson's career to continue, it's better for him to move. He's alienated so many people that it's better for him to move from. It's just that his prose style is so bad that it's better for him to move from. He's advised to move from prose fiction to TV writing, and so and then that's so there's a Twilight Zone reference.
So, yeah, I mean, I really did enjoy this book. Again, it was nothing heavy. And it's very different from some of the other things that Velleman has done, and some of which we're going to talk about. Now, you've mentioned the work, that you translated several years ago, Last Days of an Immortal, and I haven't had the pleasure of reading that yet. But one that I did read when it was first released in the U.S., and Canada, a few years back in 2014, is Beautiful Darkness, and this is one that Velleman did with. How do you pronounce that name? I know it's two people. Carochet?
No, I think it's Carosquet.
Carosquet. That's how you pronounce it.
I think you have the ET because of the Breton part.
Okay.
So it's not a normal French pronunciation.
Right, but that name is basically representative of two people, right?
Yeah, a husband and wife.
Husband and wife, yeah, that's what I thought. I can't remember their names. But that was published by Drawn Quarterly in English in 2014. A very different kind of book. But Velleman has also written a couple of series for Cinebook. I know one that we have copies of is his Alone series, and I think we have 7 volumes so far, and we can talk about that. But another series that he does with Cinebook is Green Manor, and I haven't read any of Green Manor. Have you?
Oh no, Green Manor, and also the historical series, the Marquis d'Anaon. And I believe those were the Green Manor was his first to be in English, though Beautiful Darkness is by far his biggest hit, and the most. The most widely known in English to date, and Beautiful Darkness was well known in France, but Last Days of Immortal also won a prize at Angoulême, they were and he is one of the leading pure writers on the comic scene in France today. I mean, like someone who doesn't draw. I think. He for instance, I think another book of his that's out in English is he's one of the few writers to have collaborated with Jason. The Island of a Thousand Dead People or Deaths or Dead Men.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
something like that. Yeah. So I mean, he's pretty prolific, and also for a while, I'm not sure if it's still true, but for a while he was handed the reins to one of the great French franchises of all time, Spirou, who was kind of like the alter Tintin, right? The bellboy, the bellhop in his adventures. So that's not a series we've really talked about on this, and not.
Well, I don't think it's not translated though, is it?
Any of Spirou?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean it's not. I was gonna say it's just
Maybe
not
I'm
something
wrong.
With a lot of international presence, but it's very beloved over. I don't know for sure. I'd have to look it up, but yeah. So he's got a bunch of stuff out there. A lot from Cinebook, I think, primarily, even though those aren't perhaps the best known. Though hopefully that'll change as we talk about Clear Blue Tomorrows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, let's talk a bit about, and we've talked some about Clear Blue Tomorrows. Let's talk a bit about Beautiful Darkness, because, you say that then in the English-speaking world, this is probably what he's best known for, at least in North America. I remember...
Yeah, I think that's partly because Drawn Quarterly was behind it.
Right. Now, I read this when it came out, and in fact, I was going to do a review on the blog, the Comics Alternative blog, on this book, because at around the same time, I think that Hubert's, is that how you pronounce his name? Hubert?
Yeah.
His Beauty had come out, but also Miss Don't Touch Me, and I was going to do kind of a larger review of Beautiful Darkness, Beauty, and then the 2 volumes at the time of Miss Don't Touch Me. I didn't, but so I wanted to use this opportunity of discussing Velleman's Clear Blue tomorrow to go back and reread Beautiful Darkness, and I'd forgotten about the experience of doing so. This is a warped story. Don't you think?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, and every time you say that to Velleman, he gets really happy because he's I mean, he definitely wanted to pull off. He wanted to subvert. He wanted to disturb. He wanted to pull off something that was, had a kind of surface that was quickly twisted. And it's also a story that I wouldn't say it. I wouldn't say it consists of mini stories, but it's a little episodic. It's vignette-y.
Right. Yes, exactly. And I remember my experience when I first read this is I felt that it read as if there were some kind of fairy tale attempting to come out, but it never quite does. And I think I felt that just because of the art and the scenario that we have in this story, because it's a strange scenario. Basically, it begins with a series of creatures, they look like people. I would go on to call them little creatures later on, and they're having tea. But then something happens. Things start falling, it seems, from the ceiling, and it's gooey, it's liquidy, and we don't know exactly what's happening. And in all the confusion, they start rushing around, and we see them eventually crawling outside of what looks like a young girl lying on the ground in a rainstorm. And so then we learn to find out that these little creatures have been residing inside this little girl who apparently is dead, who's been killed in a forest. And inside of her rotting corpse, at least for the first part of Beautiful Darkness, these creatures either are living or live around the forest that surrounds the body of a dead child. And so you talk about macabre.
Yeah, they're little bits. I don't know. I guess I always read them as sort of little bits of surviving consciousness that were somehow, because they're all female, right? I mean, and they kind of squabble with each other in these playground ways, like childish jealousies and hurts and things, and little power struggles, and they're I guess I sort of read them as like they're surviving bits of her. They're all doomed because the overall arc of the book is decomposition, and as decomposition of the physical body continues, the consciousness will also, I mean, the girl is clearly dead, but nevertheless, these are like some personified aspects of like, I don't know.
Yeah, I see where you're going. I've always read it more literally, right? Because not all the characters are female, because there are a few, they're mostly female, but there are a few male characters as well, and a couple have quite important, if not prominent, roles. So I guess that's why I didn't see it as, individual tiny manifestations of a body, right? Right, or at least facets of the young girl now dead, her persona or her identity, the kind of outs once she's dead. I mean, I read it more literally, like these little creatures who find themselves inside her body, but then must exit it once she starts to decompose in the rain. Which sounds freaky, right? But the stories that they have, and being out in the forest, the young protagonist, what is her name? The main character, the young blonde.
I don't remember.
She eventually finds her way to this cabin where a man lives, and of course, to her, he's a giant. So then there's the Jack and the Beanstalk element that immediately comes to mind. And so I think that's just another reason why I see this as fairy tale-esque without being a fairy tale or a folk tale in any way. But there are those impulses to this narrative that seem to want to come out but never quite do, for obvious reasons. Because if you're looking for lessons, you're looking for a moral to the story or what have you, it's definitely not there. And I like the way that you describe the adventures that these characters undergo as little vignettes, because I think that describes them quite well. And there's some cohesiveness to these little vignettes, but many times you'll find a character who is focused on through a good number of these vignettes, and then something happens to them, him or her, and then they're gone, and their death or their loss is rather abrupt and even tragic. I mean, I'm thinking of that one. We have at one point these three sisters, and I guess they're sisters, and they all look the same. They're dressed in blue. They're in little ballerina skirts, and they're dancers. And one early on in the book is climbing up a tree because she's hungry and she wants to get something to eat. And her two other sisters are behind her and they're saying, "Wait up for us." But the sister in front doesn't. And so she jumps into a bird's nest where she sees the little chicks with their mouths open. But she notices the mother bird feeding the chicks. And so that little girl thinks that if she opens her mouth wide, then she can get something to eat. Well, what happens, and this is really sick, the bird shoves its beak down into the girl's gullet to feed it because thinking it's one of her chicks. The thing is, apparently the sharp beak pierces the back of that young creature's mouth, and she's left speechless, and I think we never see her die, but she wanders off at one point. We just expect her to die, kind of a lonely, grisly death. I mean, that's dark. And little dark things like that happen to many of these other characters.
Yeah, and it's rendered in a very innocent style, as
Right.
opposed to the shots of the girl's body lying dead in the forest, which are rendered in a much, much more realistic and style with a very muted palette.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in fact, there's one section of the book, and I wanted to ask you about your take on this. It's not exactly halfway in, but it's close enough. And this is on page 48 and 49, and this is, I think, the one place in the book where the narrative pulls back from the lives of these little creatures, and we get to see this young girl when she's alive, and she's lying in a forest. It looks like it's fall because they're fall colors, and lying among leaves. It looks like she's asleep. She opens her eyes as if she hears something, and so she gets up, she looks around, brushes the leaves off of her, wanders into the forest, and then on the very bottom of page 49, we get "ee" as in a scream, as if something happened. And then when we turn the page, we see one of these little creatures who is definitely living inside of this decomposed body, who is screaming the "ee." And so is that "ee," that scream at the bottom of page 49, the scream of that little creature, or is it also the scream of the human girl who's lying in the forest moments before she's killed?
Yeah, I think it's I don't know. I always read it as C, both of the above, but in a kind of match cut way.
Exactly.
Right. Like,
but it's strange because we see her dead at the very beginning, and we see her at various parts of the book decomposing, and this insert not quite in the very middle of the book where we see her alive, so it's like a flashback to what happened to her and what brought her here. It just seemed a little out of place. Now, if we got to see the cause of her death, I think I would feel a little more satisfied, but maybe not, because we don't know who killed her. I mean, for instance, was it this guy who's living by himself in the forest?
yeah, I don't know. I guess I didn't feel that lack, but I can see where you're coming from.
Yeah.
I think
it just kind of stands out because, I mean, that's if that weren't the only moment where we got that flashback, I wouldn't think this way. But I think that being the only moment, it just struck me as a little unusual. Not that I didn't like it, but just different. I didn't expect it.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I guess because you're right. I don't think the fairy tale elements or the incipient fairy tale elements fit into my reading of, consciousness dying off. But I think that since I was reading it that way, it kind of was okay with just a focus on the girl, and the fact that her fate, her exact fate, was left open was even more haunting and macabre to me.
Yeah. Now, we also mentioned another series that Velleman does, and that is Alone. What are your thoughts on the Alone series?
Yeah, the Alone series. It's Velleman likes to call it his moneymaker because it's an explicitly YA series. It's a cast of all children, and I think of it as Lost in post-apocalyptic Paris with a cast of all children. And he sets up the characters really quickly. He draws them really, but then I feel like he does it. This is I feel like him showing off his tight-knit serial storytelling, because the books have regular cliffhangers. There's big twists. There are unexplained. There's sort of Lord of the Flies things where there's a tribe of kids living in a zoo under this kind of autocratic bully, and but there's also unexplained. I don't know, not even quite sort of fantasy science elements too, right? Yeah. Where possibly dimensional warping, and so he just kind of keeps throwing in. He keeps upping the ante as he burns through story. I feel like these are really fast reads. I think there's only up to 9 or 10 in France. I don't know. We should also know that this is a collaboration between Velleman and Gazzotti, who was one of the artists on Clear Blue Tomorrows.
Right.
But it's and it's style wise, it's they're I guess the two kind of big Belgian styles that people identify are the ligne claire, which is used mostly for adventure, the clear lines of Tintin, etc., and then the big nose style, which is much less seen in the U.S. but still really popular there, which is the style for a lot of humor comics featuring child characters. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this is almost like a cross in a way. Like you have sort of outsized cartoonish faces, a very ethnically and gender diverse cast.
Right.
So that that's very pleasing. And a little ahead of its time too, because Alone in France came out. It started, I would say 10 years ago by now. So I guess I find them quick, addictive reads. Set up a lot more, a world with a lot of mysteries in it that keep evolving and drawing you further in.
Right.
Sympathetic protagonists.
Yeah, and you're right. It is kind of addictive. When I first started this, I thought, is this going to be something that I'm going to enjoy, or am I just reading this because I want to get more Velleman under my belt before we discuss Clear Blue tomorrow? I loved it. And this is something you mentioned, an all-age text. This is something that would definitely fit right in with what Andy and Gwen do on their monthly Young Readers series. I can see where they probably wouldn't want to discuss anything like this because its availability to general readers, I think, is quite limited. But maybe that's even all the more reason to discuss it on a show like that, or even like this, right? Because it's something that, even though it may not be easy to find, once you do, you'll be pleased. And this is something definitely worth finding.
Yeah, no, I think it's it's so adventuresome, and it features a lot of, kid fantasy things of kids figuring things out, and yet it's very realistic. Kids putting together devices, kids getting to drive, but it's also very realistic and attuned to the things kids would be afraid of or find cool, or the characters are very swiftly delineated in the early volume when they started wandering around the deserted Paris. And when I say post-apocalypse, it's not exactly that, in that it just seems to be a world where all of a sudden every single adult has disappeared.
Well, and not just adults, because some of the kids have disappeared as well.
And then the buildings are intact, but they're they're menaced by runaway animals, basic survival, infighting, Yeah, I guess there are definitely traditional elements of some big bads turn out to be
good guys at heart, or but I guess I feel like I find them very credible as children as well.
Right. I agree. Now, it's interesting, when you first started talking about this, you likened it to Lost. When I first started reading Alone, I couldn't help but think of the Left Behind series. Now, I've never read the series, but I've heard about the series. And, these kids are wondering, where did everyone else go? It's primarily the adults, but also there are some younger people who have disappeared as well. And so it's almost as if this group of kids that become the protagonists are the ones who are left behind, and they don't know what happened to everyone else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The French title, I think you can't go wrong with this, because, especially when on DCBS they're having it for like $10 a pop, you're getting like 60, 50, 55 pages of, really solid, fast moving story. I don't think in my books, unfortunately, they don't seem to. Okay, in the later ones they credit the translation to the same to Jerome Saint-Quentin again. Yeah, it's basically the same title as in French, except that because in French you can you have adjective agreement, so alone is also plural, where it's because it's about this group of kids, so you get that little note there that maybe that you really can't carry over into English.
Right. Well, we discussed quite a number of texts for this month. The two that we focused on were Cyril Pedrosa's Equinoxes and Clear Blue Tomorrows by Velleman, Meyer, and Gazzotti. But we also discussed other books by Pedrosa and Velleman. So, for instance, we also, spent a bit of time discussing Pedrosa's Three Shadows, Hearts at Sea, and Portugal. And we also gave some good podcast time to Velleman's Beautiful Darkness, the Alone series, and Last Days of an Immortal.
Yeah.
Yep. So a lot of good stuff out there. And in fact, Edward and I were tempted to, for January, focus on just one of these creators, right? That we would do an all Pedrosa episode, and then in February we would do an all Febian Velleman show, or vice versa. Maybe January would be Velleman, and then February Pedrosa. But both Equinoxes and Clear Blue Tomorrows came out previously in the past few months, and we wanted to go ahead and get to them, and because again, they were kind of piling up.
Yeah, and there's so many more good comics to cover out there. So, we just wanted to keep moving along and being able to move on to more and more coverage.
Exactly. And in fact, I don't know if you feel this way, Edward, but when you and I met each other back last spring and we were discussing the idea for this monthly series, I don't know if I thought that there would be near as many new translations that we would want to discuss on the show as there actually are. But once we started to discover everything that was out there, it's like, oh my God. I mean, there's no way to talk about everything that we want to, because we had thought about talking about newer material as well as older translations, but just keeping up with the recent translations is more than we can do.
Yeah. I mean, I do think we, today's episode worked out well because I definitely did want some more archival coverage or the chance to sort of dig deep into certain universes, like, or genres, or like, we've talked about like doing just a Jodorowsky verse episode or something like that, so they're covered in the Meta Barons and the Incal, etc. But like, I think we covered more titles than we've referenced today. We've referenced more titles than ever before on an episode, and I think that really helped to contextualize these recent releases, both in the previous available works and in the creator's own developments.
Exactly. Yeah, I really had a good time with this episode in reading the works of Pedrosa and Velleman. And if you want to check out great comics like this, then you should head over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. And in fact, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, You can find several of Velleman's titles, as Edward pointed out at the top of the show. So that's dcbservice.com. You can't go wrong with those guys. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our January Eurocomics episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can write us, do write us emails. You can reach us both at twoguys@comicsalternative.com, or you can write directly to me at edward@comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media, including Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to get in touch with us.
And we really would appreciate it if you write, just any got comments, questions, new titles that you're excited about, especially, or old titles that, or more work by people you want to see or people you've heard about.
Yeah, exactly. Introduce us to some authors that we may not be familiar with. And you can also get in touch with us and hold Edward's feet to the fire that he will finish his dissertation this year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, however and whatever you want to say, definitely do get in touch. And until next month, I'm Derek.
I'm Edward.
See you later.
Bye.